Welcome back to Mike and Maurice's Mind Escape. Let us help you escape your mind. All right, folks, welcome back to Mike and Maurice's Mind Escape. We have episode number 122 today. It's a special one, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, with Dr. Rick Strassman. Dr. Strassman is currently an American Clinical Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine. From 1990 to 1995, Dr. Strassman led a U.S. government-approved and funded clinical research team at the University of New Mexico. They studied the effects of N-Dimethyltryptamine, aka DMT, on human subjects in experimental conditions. Dr. Strassman is the president and co-founder of the Cottonwood Research Institute. He is also the author of DMT, the Spirit Molecule, Inner Paths to Outer Space, DMT, the Soul of Prophecy, and his latest book, Joseph Levy Escapes Death. He also co-produced the movie, which many of you I'm sure have seen, DMT, the Spirit Molecule. I have the links below the video so you can go check out his website and also go onto his Amazon page and buy any of the books that you haven't checked out of his already. They're all definitely worth a read. If you are watching this interview on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. If you are listening to this podcast on an audio platform, please subscribe on there. And if you have not already, please check out our Patreon at patreon.com/Mike and Maurice for $2 a month. You'll get exclusive content, interviews, and video. Check out our website at mikeandmauricemindescape.com. And also, we just started a Discord channel. So if you're on Discord, come on over, join our channel. We'd love to chat. So without further ado, we appreciate you all listening. And here's Dr. Rick Strassman. Welcome to Mind Escape. We're honored to have you on.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I know we tried this live and it didn't work out, but I'm really glad that we were able to set this up and figure out these technical issues. My first question pertains to your research from 1990 to 1995 that was documented in DMT, the Spirit Molecule. You were the first person in 20 years that the government allowed to research psychedelic or entheogenic substances. What was it about your research or your pitch to them that helped them allow you to do this these studies?
Well, there were probably a couple main things, but the overarching theme, I believe, that let them consider granting permission and giving us funding, were my qualifications. That was one thing, and the other was that the study was pretty much keeping it simple and quite rigorous at the same time. Well, so I had already completed one of my first independent clinical research study looking at melatonin. And the reason I looked at melatonin was I was thinking the pineal gland and melatonin were involved somehow in spiritual experience. And that didn't turn out to be the case. Melatonin turned out to be only sedating. And in the meantime, I had learned about DMT, which had been given to humans before and was clearly psychedelic. So I changed my, research focus, but I had already established, my credentials as a, independent clinical researcher. I'd gotten a grant, to do the melatonin work. I had, published papers. I had this, support of the University of New Mexico and the Clinical Research Center. So that was, one thing, the infrastructure and my qualifications as a clinical psychopharmacology researcher. The other, was the protocol, was the study itself. It was ironclad in a lot of ways. I didn't claim to be doing anything psychotherapeutically. I wasn't looking at anything spiritual. it was just psychopharmacology. What happens when you give DMT to people, normal volunteers, without any expectations other than a careful description of the psychological and biological effects.
Were they looking for hard scientific data? Let's say maybe how DMT would affect somebody's blood pressure, or what were they expecting to get out of this, or what were they expecting from you to produce from these studies?
Well, there were a couple of things. One, was to just, prove or establish or, demonstrate you could do clinical research with these, drugs in humans again after such a long hiatus.
Mm-hmm.
The other or another was that there were a lot of animal data that had been, generated in the 20 years since the human arena had closed down. Uh, the, there were quite a few animal studies which were continuing apace and had been key in developing our understanding of the the role of serotonin in neuroscience. The development of the SSRI antidepressants were dependent in a lot of ways on the pharmacology of LSD, which had been teased apart in those intervening 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
So they were interested in confirming or refuting, the animal data in the human. Were the animal data comparable to the human or not? The other things were that people were continuing to use psychedelics recreationally, and with all the new data out there that had been generated in lower animals, there was interest in understanding the biology of simple psychedelic compound like DMT.
Mm-hmm.
Also, before human research had ended, there were some tantalizing leads about the role of DMT in psychosis, because DMT is produced naturally in the human body.
Mm-hmm.
There was quite a bit of interest in were there abnormalities in the production of DMT in schizophrenics, for example.
They have run tests on schizophrenics' urine, if I'm not mistaken, to prove or disprove that theory.
Yeah, they were comparing levels of DMT between normals and people with psychosis.
Mm-hmm.
They were giving DMT to schizophrenics and asking them to compare the visions on the drug with their normally occurring visions. There was interest in blockading the production of DMT or the effects of DMT somehow in an attempt to reduce schizophrenic symptoms.
Now, I'd like to ask you a question about mice or rodents with these tests. Recently, on an episode of The Portal, which is Eric Weinstein's podcast, his brother Brett Weinstein, who is an evolutionary biologist, tells the story about how he predicted that these rodents or mice from Jack's Labs, which is the lab where most scientists, I believe, get their mice from. He predicted that they have extremely long telomeres, which are extensions of chromosomes that are associated with senescence. Now, the reason why this is important is because the mice that they were breeding them early, so their life cycle was cut short, and they had no predators. This caused, I believe, the elongation of the telomeres, so they were extremely long, way longer than a normal field mouse found in the wild. And all that data suggests that a lot of the studies that are done using rodents or mice could be flawed by this process, since most labs get their rodents or mice from this Jack's Labs in Maine. So my question to you is DMT affected by this? They've done DMT studies with rodents, and does this affect it? Do you think that DMT is correlated with aging or senescence at all? Or, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, the point that you raise about laboratory versus wild animals is key in justifying doing human studies. that's why you need human studies to either confirm or refute animal data. Yeah, so whether or not DMT extends longevity is an interesting question. There are uh, some data indicating that DMT reduces the toxicity of hypoxia in the nervous system. So if you have a low level of oxygen, let's say from a stroke or heart attack in the brain, DMT will reduce the brain damage or the nerve damage, resulting from those low levels of oxygen. So you might think, well, and some people. There was a report. I think it was just in an Indian newspaper, from India, about this physician who had concocted this formula, this cocktail of DMT and a number of other compounds to give to stroke patients in order to resuscitate them or reduce the amount of damage. I've never been able to track down any scientific papers, but it's a interesting concept that the guy probably developed from those animal data
Right.
regarding hypoxic damage. If you look at ayahuasqueros in Latin America, it's uh, they look rather young, and they drink a lot of ayahuasca 3 times a week, 6
Right.
times a week, all day long, all like every day.
But it's like
sometimes.
microdosing to them, right?
The ayahuasqueros I've been around, they drink a full dose whenever they drink, and they drink frequently. So there could be some anti-aging effect. I mean, I wouldn't go out and recommend, if you want to stay young and keep
Sure.
your skin shiny and rosy, to drink ayahuasca regularly.
Right.
But still, the antioxidant effects, the anti-inflammatory effects of psychedelics are being characterized now. There's a scientist in Vanderbilt, I think, or LSU. I think the LSU Medical School, who's been looking at the anti-inflammatory effects of the psychedelics. So microdosing. I mean, there's information about increased neuroplasticity from low doses or full doses of psychedelics. That could be the way in which they work as antidepressants. And neuroplasticity, you increase the growth of neurons and their extensions. That could be potentially beneficial.
So we just touched on rodents. Now I want to transition to human beings. And since you did your test on human beings, I was wondering if there is ever going to be a way that we can quantify the levels of DMT within somebody's system, or can prove how much is being produced, or something along those lines, or is technology nowhere near being able to do that?
Well, concentrations in blood, urine, and spinal fluid in the human are really low, billionths of a gram per milliliter. So we don't quite have the technology down yet to be able to establish normative values and then compare them to other conditions, either pathological conditions like psychosis or expanded conditions, let's say like meditation. But we are understanding the genetic machinery of DMT synthesis that's being worked out, especially in a laboratory in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Um, they're looking at the genetic regulation of the enzymes responsible for DMT synthesis. It's been primarily in the rodent, but they've also been looking at the comparable mechanisms in human postmortem tissue. So a few, like mid 2019, the fall, maybe September, the group in Ann Arbor published a paper demonstrating DMT synthesis in the rodent brain, for the first time. I think if we're going to be looking at increases of synthesis of DMT or decrease synthesis, it isn't going to be by determining the levels of the drug or the compound in the body, but more the activation or the deactivation of the machinery that makes it.
You addressed part of my next question too with the U of M studies, but I believe they induced cardiac arrest in the rodents and showed that the enzymes were produced in the brain and not just the pineal gland. So when you think about near-death experiences, and I've talked to a lot of people, we've had near-death experience experts on our show before. I've interviewed people that have had just near-death experiences, just DMT experiences, and then a couple people that have had both. And they say the people that have had both mention that there is some commonality between them, but they do say that it's not really the same thing.
Yeah. Well, the concentrations of DMT in the brain increased in cardiac arrest in that study. Not the enzymes per se. The actual concentrations of DMT.
Okay.
And interestingly enough, the increase in DMT, wasn't any different in animals with or without a pineal gland. The Ann Arbor group's original 2013 study, which demonstrated DMT in the pineal, probably was more of a reflection of the probe going into the pineal, snagging brain tissue on the way in and out. So it was brain DMT which that 2013 paper was demonstrating, not pineal DMT.
Mm-hmm.
So to the extent that a non-drug state resembles that brought on by giving DMT, there's got to be some overlap in the biology.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've spoken to people who have both had an NDE as well as having used DMT, and they describe some overlap, that is in some ways confirmatory regarding a role for DMT in the subjective experience of the NDE. The NDE, or the death experience, is a very complicated thing. Your brain is dying, right? And it's just not going to be DMT that's going through the roof. There's going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of other physiological alterations. So to say that DMT elevation causes the NDE is a little too simplistic. There's like an entourage, a concert of effects, and to the extent that there are DMT-like effects in the NDE, perhaps endogenous elevation of DMT is playing a role.
Okay, so we've had author and friend of the show Tom Lane on quite a few times now, but I believe it was the second time we had him on. He referenced a study from 2002 where scientists were studying the pineal gland, and they found tiny calcite microcrystals in the shape of cubes, hexagons, and cylinders. And he mentions that the scientists also either crushed them or broke them up, and it created some sort of rainbow dust or rainbow cloud or something along those lines. So I looked up the study, and the study also talks about symmetrical crystal breaking and possible connection with piezoelectricity. And being a musician and having worked on a decent amount of guitars in my day, PRS, Paul Reed Smith guitars incorporate piezoelectricity or piezoelectric pickup systems in their guitars. I was just wondering what you know about this study.
Well, I remember that study. Yeah, I'm not sure. There's a lot of urban myths about the pineal gland,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
and I'm responsible, probably for a fair amount of them. But yeah, the pineal gland is curious. People can live normal lives without a pineal gland.
Mm-hmm.
There's pineal tumors which have to be removed. There's cysts that get too big and have to be removed. There's strokes that occur around the pineal and destroy it. There's cancer occupying lesions that destroy the pineal, and by and large, those people are relatively normal. It isn't like they don't dream or they hallucinate or have weird, perceptual abnormalities.
Mm-hmm.
It's been, sometimes, since I've, looked into like case, surveys of people without pineal glands. You
Right.
know, but the last time I did, the main abnormality is they had problems adjusting to transcontinental travel or
Mm-hmm.
intercontinental travel. Their melatonin is important,
Right.
for the reentrainment of circadian rhythms and the remediation of jet lag. So they didn't respond or didn't improve their sleep wake cycles as quickly as a pineal on it. As a human, with an intact pineal gland. But otherwise, they're pretty much, normal. So
Sure.
even though I've promoted the DMT theory of pineal function, it's yet to be proven.
The study also correlates to autoconia, I believe it's pronounced, which are biocrystals that help maintain body balance and your sense of gravity and acceleration, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So reading that, my mind went to the pineal as possibly some sort of piezoelectric receiver or something along those lines. But again, a lot of this stuff speculation. Looking at all the research that's been done since your trials in the early 90s, is there anything that you would have changed or something you regret not doing? Or is there something that you would have looked at differently? Or do you think about that kind of stuff?
Well, there were some, things which I would have, liked to have been different. It was hard to get a good team around me. Um, I'm a good, one man show, but I'm not
Mm-hmm.
that great team, a team player. Like I was, captain of the track team in high school, right?
Uh,
And social director of my freshman college dorm. But to to assemble a mature group of clinical researchers, nurses, that kind of thing, was a little more than I could accomplish at that stage in my life. And it wasn't because of, well it wasn't completely because of my personality. I think it also had to do with the stage of the science. I came out of the blue with this study. It had been 20 years since any human research with these with these compounds had taken place, and I had been strategizing with a bunch of colleagues around the country and saying, anybody who breaks open the door, let's get together, let's, form a group. But, once I actually accomplished what everybody was, telling me I would, never be able to accomplish, nobody wanted to join me.
Right.
Albuquerque was too small. There weren't enough malls. The kids had to finish school, that kind of thing.
You were a
So I was
pioneer.
kind of left, holding the ball, like, right, right. So I was, forced in a way into a, psychopharmacological, corner. It was it, was a really great strategy to, get things up and running. But
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't only interested in looking at the brain response to, psychedelics and the receptors and whatnot. That was key to establishing the validity of getting this research off the ground again.
Mm-hmm.
But there were more clinical reasons, like therapy, spirituality, consciousness, those kinds of things, which colleagues would have been helpful in being able to expand the scope of the research. And as it turned out, without any colleagues, it was just more, psychopharmacology, and I started to, feel like I was, treating my volunteers like large lab rats.
Mm.
So I thought, well, I should just get out, while I'm ahead, and let's see what the rest of the field can do.
So before we get to all the research and stuff having to do with your books, I want to touch on a couple questions that I had regarding DMT and stuff people have brought up. Recently on London Real, which is it's like a sit-down talk show / podcast kind of a thing on YouTube, but they had this guest named Mantak Chia on, who I believe he's from Asia, and he was talking about his teachers and how they teach that if you were to sit in complete darkness for 2 weeks, your body would naturally start to produce high levels of DMT and go into these altered states without any sort of external chemical intervention. Do you think that there's any truth to that?
Well, no, we don't really know that that's the case. You know, if you put an animal in constant darkness, their pineal gland grows
Mm-hmm.
and they produce more melatonin. If you put a human in a cave or a dark apartment for a couple of weeks, they start to have visions,
Mm-hmm.
and mood changes and things like that. But whether or not those are the result of the pineal producing more DMT or 5-methoxy DMT, we just don't know.
Yeah, I was just curious because there are weird tales, like Da Vinci disappearing into a cave for a long time and then emerging some sort of artistic and scientific master. So, I have looked through several different accounts in the ancient times and of people disappearing into caves and somehow coming out with an advanced knowledge of the world or the universe. But my next question has to do with whether there's any validity to DMT being a birth or a death hormone, that when we're born and when we die, we release this. Also, there's a myth that's been circulating for a while now where people or some people have mentioned that if you smoke it or you do it, that you permanently reduce or alter the levels of DMT that occur naturally in your body.
Yeah. Well, the birth thing is a theory I put forth in the DMT book.
Right.
And that related to the pineal gland in the beginning anyway. The 49-day stage theory. The pineal gland is first visible in the human embryo at 49 days.
Mm-hmm.
That distinction between gonad sexual differentiation occurs at 49 days. And the bardo, after one person dies and the soul reincarnates in a new human body, is 49 days. So I kind of speculated, kind of wild-eyed speculation, to be honest, about 49 days, the pineal, the life force, the DMT. But DMT may not even be made in the pineals, so that may turn out to be moot. But also at the time of birth, for the mother anyway, birth is a psychedelic process. It's really wild, and the relevance or the role of elevated DMT in the birth process, at least for the mother, remains to be explicated. And the time of death is something we spoke about already. Whether or not smoking DMT reduces your own production of it, there's no evidence to support that idea. I don't think any studies in lower animals have been done. Yeah, I don't think there have been. That would be a study, for the Ann Arbor group.
Right.
If you infuse an animal with DMT, does that reduce the activity of the genetic machinery? But their data is hot off the press, more or less.
Right.
So they're expanding their studies, but there's a lot more to be figured out.
So now I want to get to your books. and because we just got through pretty much all the questions that I had been saving up if I were to ever interview you. So we got through that. But I do want to talk about DMT and the soul of prophecy, because I think most people know about DMT, the spirit molecule, and your documentary DMT, the spirit molecule, hosted by Joe Rogan. Actually, by the way, have you ever met Joe Rogan, or do you know Joe Rogan?
Yeah, we had coffee at Starbucks in Sherman Oaks once a long time ago. Yeah,
Oh.
and we hit it off. Well, who doesn't hit it off with Joe Rogan? He's like
Yeah.
the
Well,
coolest guy there is.
Yeah, you had already built up a reputation through your research, obviously, but I think he's done a tremendous job of helping spread the word about your work and others' work in the psychedelic field over the last 10 years.
Well, the first time I spoke to Joe, he was at the airport, and I said, it's Rick Strassman. He said, "Hey, man, I'm reading your book. I love your book." Yeah, so he's been really great, for the DMT story.
Yeah, well, we definitely love his podcast, and he was one of the catalysts for us starting Mind Escape. So, yeah, so DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, I've read it once, and I've also listened to the Audible version, because I do think that there are things that you pick up on Audible or listening to a book on tape that you don't get necessarily from reading it. But I wanted to ask you, what was going on? Because in the book you describe the prophets of the Old Testament and having these visionary experiences, but it's still unclear what exactly was going on. So I was curious, do you think it was from wandering the desert and starvation, inducing some sort of DMT state, or lucid dreaming, or what do you think was happening, and how do you think they were achieving these states?
Well, to the extent that the phenomenology of the prophetic experience, the visions and the voices, the out-of-body experience, the intense emotions, the inspiration, to the extent that those descriptions in prophetic figures resemble the phenomenology of giving DMT, it makes sense that perhaps elevated levels of DMT in the prophetic state are mediating those similarities in phenomenology. So what is elevating the endogenous DMT? There's no evidence of visions and voices in prophetic figures in the text taking drugs. There's just none. Zero. So let's disabuse any listeners of that theory, because you've got DMT in your brain already. You don't have to look under every nook and cranny, under every rock, nibble every fungus and say, oh, that's what they're doing.
Right.
That's just not the case, or at least it's been expunged from the entire Hebrew Bible, which is
Right.
unlikely. Why would that be done?
There are mentions, though, of the tamarisk tree and the acacia, and I know in that region there definitely is Paganum harmala, which would be the MAO inhibitor. So I was just curious if you think that it was possible for them to find that. I know people were probably trying stuff, or do you not think that that was the case? Because acacia and tamarisk are both rich in DMT. It would have been sort of a Middle Eastern ayahuasca analog.
Yeah. There, a number of hypotheses have been presented. Like perhaps the burning bush was acacia. DMT is in a number of acacia species. Paganum is an Assyrian rue, which grows in the desert. There's a fungus that contains ergot alkaloids like LSD that could grow in the desert. Cannabis, cannabis in the incense, but it's all pretty oblique, and
Right.
there just aren't any specific references. What the references are God or an angel speaks to the prophet. So sometimes, that's, the result of starvation or stress or whatnot, sleep deprivation. But, generally not. Generally it's unbidden. God decides that it's time to relay information to humanity or the community of the Hebrews at that point, or in those circumstances. And God locates an appropriate candidate based on their intellectual prowess, their virtuousness, their piety, their standing in the community, the level of their imagination, their being articulate, which isn't really the case with Moses anyway, at least in the beginning. But still, you could look at the elevated levels of DMT resulting from a top-down influence. God decides, and then through what's called emanation or efflux or overflow, there's this divine energy which contains information from God that stimulates the imagination, which is the location of the visions and the voices. And it contains information that's the intellect of the prophet then extracts and says, I've had a vision, this is what the vision means. And they share it with the with the populace. The other way that elevated levels of endogenous DMT might occur is from the bottom up, from starvation or from drugs or from sleep deprivation. In which case, it isn't only the elevated DMT; it's the person of the prophet. There's a lot of people that smoke a lot of DMT. Their brain levels of DMT increase, but they're not prophets, and they're not making a major contribution, to the larger community. So it depends on the person who is experiencing elevated levels of endogenous DMT. So in the top-down, the top-down model, which is the one that I propose in the DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, it's kind of a modern iteration of medieval Neoplatonized Aristotelianism. The emanation from above,
right,
overflows into the brain, into
it's
the
almost
mind,
like a Gnostic idea
produces
in a
the
way.
visions, and in a way, yeah, that's the Neoplatonic part, is
Right.
the Gnostic influence. Yeah, the emanation from the spheres, downward into denser,
Right.
denser, forms of existence.
Do you think DMT had a huge impact on ancient Jewish mysticism like Merkabah and Kabbalah?
Well, Kabbalah, which I don't really, know that much about. I've mostly focused on the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament.
Sure.
Kabbalah is just too complicated.
Mm-hmm.
It's just too complicated, for me. The Bible is, plenty. Like I'll, shift my camera a bit and show you, my bookshelves. Those are all books on the Bible.
Damn.
Yeah, so there's plenty that's been written about the Bible. It's an untappable resource. But that being said, the Kabbalists, or at least some, like to induce visions. So to the extent that certain practices induce visions, and to the extent those visions resemble that which occurs, or those which occur when you smoke DMT, there's got to be some biological overlap. Perhaps elevated levels of DMT. It's interesting. The founder of Hasidism, the Baal, the Besht, a Polish Jewish mystic, used to smoke the smoking mixture in his pipe and would take flights to heaven, come back after these visions and say, I saw Elijah. I saw the throne. I saw the chariot. The Merkabah. So there's been a lot of speculation about what was what was that rabbi smoking back then. But still, the vast majority of Hasidics or Kabbalists don't take outside substances. There's a rabbi up in Colorado Springs, Rabbi Baxt, who's speculated a lot about the pineal DMT and Kabbalah, and I have spoken with him a number of times about, well, the pineal may not make DMT, and he's got an interesting response. He is he's as much interested in the Sefirot, the chakras in Kabbalah, that go up and down the spine,
right,
and the shoulders and the hips and whatnot. Yeah, so it's more of a like it's almost a spiritual pineal and a metaphysical one, rather than a purely biological one.
Well, it's pretty clear that you study religion. Are you a religious man yourself or spiritual? How would you describe yourself?
Well, I was always interested in states, like, states of mind. But I never really quite connected it, to Judaism. I'm Jewish. I was raised Jewish, went to Hebrew school for years after public school, was bar mitzvahed, but they never really talked much about God or religious experience. It was a conservative tradition that I was raised in. Well, conservative Judaism, and we mostly this was the 50s and the 60s, and World War II was not that far in the past, and Israel's independence was not that far in the past. So there was a lot of emphasis on the miracle of the resurgence of the Jews and the reestablishment of Israel as their home. So I really didn't get much of a spiritual hit from Judaism. I found that in Zen Buddhism, actually, which I began studying and practicing when I was 22. And I learned to meditate. I learned about controlling your mind. I learned about states of consciousness. Yeah, and then at a certain point, I kind of wanted to return to my Jewish roots. So in my 40s, 44, 45, I returned to studying the text, the Hebrew Bible, because of a number of circumstances. Yeah, and you can't study the Old Testament without having to consider God and angels and prophecy and how to live your life and how to pray and those kinds of things. So well, I'm in Gallup, New Mexico. There's not many Jews here. There's no temple, there isn't any rabbi, no synagogue. So I'm kind of a congregation of one. So I mostly study. I've always approached things through books and through thinking about them. So I've become kind of an amateur Bible scholar, and I do some prayers, like before and after meals, before I go to bed, when I wake up first thing, when things are good, when things are bad, but I keep things pretty simple. I would say that study is my prayer most of the time. Study is my meditation.
While we're on the topic of meditation, I meditate a lot. We just created a couple of meditation tracks for our channel so our listeners and viewers can meditate. But I have a question. When I'm deep in meditation, whether it's before bed or I either meditate early in the morning or before bed, and I get these strobing lights in my peripheral. They're almost like spotlights or strobe lights, and they dance around, and the deeper I go, the more intense they get, and I kind of follow them around, but then you can never bring them to your, the forefront. Do you have any idea what that is or what that could be? I've also talked to other people and they've experienced the same thing. So again, I was just curious if you knew what that phenomena was.
They're called phosphenes,
Mm.
form constants, which are amplified when you take psychedelics. I think responsible, for the at least the kaleidoscopic display of colors, and perhaps they coalesce into the more discrete visions. Yeah, they're an activity of the brain.
Okay.
Everything is electrochemical in our brain, so there must be some electrochemical things going on that are activating the visual cortex or the optic tract. It's interesting, those studies from Ann Arbor.
Mm-hmm.
The highest concentrations of DMT were in the visual cortex in the rodent. So there is clearly a relationship between DMT and with the visual system.
Yeah, I mean, we were just talking about angels, and sometimes these things flutter around and almost look like they have wings or something like that. So it's kind of interesting to think about that maybe that could be, the source of some of these things. But so none of this would be possible without this thing called a tripoperon or tripoperon, and it's the ancient or primordial source of tryptophan. And I was thinking about it, and tryptophan's super essential part of our biochemistry, and it's pretty much how all this stuff, plays off of each other. My question is, could there be a world where tryptophan doesn't exist and we're still living, or we evolved without it? And if that's the case, what would life be like without that? Would we still be the same? Would we be different? I know it's kind of a complex or loaded question, but what do you think?
Well, it's kind of loaded, but it's kind of complicated. I'm not sure how to answer it really.
Okay.
Well, tryptophan is the dietary precursor for the synthesis of DMT in mammals, and it's also the plant precursor for the production of DMT in plants. And tryptophan is an ancient compound. Its synthesis of DMT from tryptophan is quite simple.
Mm-hmm.
You begin with dietary tryptophan. You convert it to tryptamine. Then you add a couple of methyl groups, and you have dimethyltryptamine, DMT. So it's an archaic compound. Tryptophan's an archaic compound. DMT is an archaic compound. It's widespread through nature. Fish, sponges, lizards, mammals, reptiles, amphibians. So yeah, it's widespread through nature. One thing I've kind of joked about is that DMT might be seen as some kind of spiritual Esperanto.
Mm-hmm.
It's the common language that's shared among all organisms which possess it. Obviously that's a tough theory to even test, let alone prove. But it's an interesting idea, and could be responsible for the empathy that you feel when you trip with other forms of life, which isn't as common when you're looking at a rock, let's say, and you're tripping. You could, I mean, the Buddha nature is in mountains, right, and in rocks, but I think it's a bit more palpable or apprehensible with living things. So it's interesting to think about the widespread nature of DMT within living beings as one of the ways to explain that feeling of empathy.
Do you know, have we always had the MAO inhibitor, or is that something that human beings evolved over time? And there's a guy that does TED Talk. I think his name's Anil Seth, and he mentions that we're always tripping all the time. And it made me think, maybe could there have been a point in human history where we didn't evolve the MAO inhibitor yet, and we could have been tripping all day or all night? Or what do you think?
Well, I mean, it would seem to me, that's a extremely brief, half-life of DMT, which is only just a few minutes. If it was always being produced and always, being at a, well, let me backtrack a bit. The half-life of DMT is quite short, and that's a result of it being broken down by MAO. So without MAO, DMT would last longer. So when you have a compound that's broken, that is broken down that quickly, you would speculate that it's a compound which is important for short-term adaptations or short-term activity. It's produced when it's needed, and it's broken down when it's not. Levels stay low. So I've never really thought about it, but it would seem to me that if that needs to be the case, there needs to be a homeostatic mechanism regulating the production and circulation of DMT.
Mm-hmm.
That the MAO enzyme would need to have evolved at the same time as the evolution of DMT. To kind of keep it in balance.
Okay, so now I want to get to some questions from friends of the show and some of our patrons. And Dick Kahn, who's the author of DMT and My Occult Mind and DMT and My Occult Mind Part 2, he just released. He wanted to know, what do you believe your greatest contribution to science is based on your experiments in the 90s?
Well, I think, from the point of view of, science, strictly defined, I mean, our work reopened the door to clinical research in the U.S. So, scientifically, our study was quite, simple. You give the drug, you measure outcomes, biological, psychological, autonomic, and, that's that. But well, that's not entirely true. Let me maybe qualify that. There's a push to call these drugs entheogens. They activate the divine within, or they're psychotomimetics. They make you psychotic, at least temporarily. So what do these drugs do, or what is their inherent nature? And I think that our study, from the scientific point of view, basically, said they are, psychedelic drugs. They're mind manifesting, they're mind disclosing. So in our volunteers, they were normal volunteers. They didn't know much about, DMT, if anything. This was in the early 1990s. And I just, said to people, have your trip. The drug is fast, it's short. You may feel like you've left your body. Don't worry. We're here to, provide the anchor, but otherwise, just have your trip. Keep your wits about you. Try to remember everything you can and report, back to us. So people had their own trips. We weren't, telling them, or we weren't, preparing them with, 10 hours or, 12 hours of, psychotherapy, saying, these drugs are mystico-mimetic and you'll see God and you'll become one with the universe.
Right.
Or we didn't say these, drugs are, madness occasioning, they're going to make you mad temporarily. We just said, this is a strong drug, which is rather visual and short and intense. Yeah. And, people had the kind of trip that they wanted or they needed or they wished for. For example, only one volunteer, had what you would call a classic NDE. And, that was a nurse who her whole life wanted to have an NDE. She'd studied it, she'd read about it, she'd gone to groups, she'd gone to workshops. And, she, had an NDE. There was one person with a bona fide mystical experience. This person was a religious studies major in college who always wanted to have mystical experience. There was one shamanic dismemberment, death rebirth experience in an urban shaman who didn't expect to have that kind of a trip until he died or was much older. So with no preparation other than hold on to your hats, we'll be looking after you. People experience the kind of trip that they already were primed for. So I think that's an important thing to consider when you're looking at the panacea-like effect of psychedelics in this current wave of research. They help everything. They help spouse abuse, prisoner recidivism. They make you more open. They make you more mindful in your meditation. Depression, addiction, OCD, terminal illness, you name it. They do it. So what does that mean, or what does that indicate? I think it indicates a super activation of the placebo effect. Because if you look at how Charles Manson gave LSD to his volunteers or his followers, he collected a group of poorly formed psychopaths.
Sure.
They were kind of vague psychopaths, and he gave them LSD. He prepared them. He told them what was going on, and they became dedicated psychopaths, completely committed to this bizarre cause.
Right.
So you can give LSD to people and they become serial killers. You can give LSD to people and they become meditative geniuses. So it all depends on who and what the drug is working on, which in a way is a reflection of activating the innate healing or growth mechanisms in the mind-body complex. So that's the hallmark of the placebo, is it activates the inherent healing mechanisms in the mind and the body unconsciously in a very strange way. So I think, other than me opening up the regulatory door to being able to do clinical studies in the US, plus establishing that the drugs are neutral in their inherent properties, it just depends on who you're giving the drugs to. I think the largest contribution I might be able to make is to consider or to think of psychedelics as being unparalleled tools to understand the placebo effect. It could be all these brain changes that we see are just reflections of the placebo effect being activated, which can be turned to improved functioning, less drug abuse, less depression, better meditation. So I don't think I don't think that psychedelics stop addiction because they're because they possess some kind of anti-addiction characteristics, but they activate the placebo response, which then cures the addiction in a real objective way.
It amplifies what you want it to.
Yeah, and I think the placebo response is the most amazing thing within the medical world. Your psychotherapy could be considered a placebo. So I think that psychedelics might be the key to understanding the placebo response.
Absolutely. You mentioned a shamanic experience that that person had. And another friend of the show and author, Aaron Voot, author of Spirit in the Sky, made correlations between the myth of Osiris, correlating it to Orion, and also, you look at what a shamanic experience is. People are dismembered and taken to the underworld and then put back together. And you look at the myth of Osiris, and he's dismembered, taken to the underworld, and then I believe Thoth and Isis piece him back together, if I'm not mistaken. And we know the ancient Egyptians had blue lotus with the active ingredient aporphine, but it's not the same thing as DMT. But based on your research with DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, if that was going on then during the times of the Old Testament, do do you think that that's possible, that those experiences were going on in ancient Egypt? And if so, do you think there's any correlation there?
Yeah, well, that's an important question, because it bespeaks, the content of the visionary state. And you can look at, the phenomenology, like there are, colors and there are shapes and there are motions, thinking is altered. You hear things, you see things, you know, you know, but the content, the information, the forms that the content of the trip takes are dependent on the culture, on the personality, on the prevailing religious ideas that permeate the culture. So I would imagine that people in Egypt, ancient Egypt, had certain ideas which were then made that much more real through their visions. Like they may think, oh, I wonder if the sun has got intelligence. They've already been thinking about that, and they trip for whatever reason. They take a blue lotus, or they use psychedelic, or their brain levels of DMT increase from starving or sleep deprivation, and they flash on the sun is intelligent. The sun does have intelligence. I see it, I feel it, I understand it. So it's making more real what they were thinking about or speculating about. And that is dependent on what they were already thinking and speculating about. It isn't inherent in the substance itself. The
So it kind of speaks to that
substance
placebo thing you were
simply,
obviously describing.
it confirms previous beliefs, either more or less conscious. You have to take into account the existence of the unconscious, which is Freud's great discovery. It isn't like an agnostic person, or like an atheist person takes psilocybin, becomes a believer in God just out of the blue.
Right.
Those were already percolating in the back of their mind, and the drug just kind of shone a spotlight on it, and they said, oh, I guess I was wrong. But that's not changing your mind. That's just becoming more aware of what you weren't quite aware of in the first place. That's why Michael Pollan's book kind of drives me crazy. Changing your mind, it's not changing your mind at all. It's just making you more aware of what's already there.
Sure. Yeah. Some of the stuff in his book kind of aggravated me too, and I think speaks to his lack of experience with these substances. And there's not much in regards to the ancient or indigenous use of these substances. So I want to touch on one more thing, because I know we're running low on time here, but we've had your colleague on, Dr. Andrew Gallimore, who's the author of the book Alien Information Theory. Great book, highly recommended. If you didn't listen to our episode with him, please go check it out. But when you look at the experiment of putting somebody in the DMT state for 45 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, however long it may be, what do you think? Is there too far, or do you think it just depends on the person's mindset going into it, or what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, it would, it would obviously depend on the person, the doses, and why they were participating in that activity. Maybe some background to that model. We did a study which was it was to determine if tolerance develops to repeated dosing of DMT. If you give LSD, or you take LSD every day for a few days, you stop responding. You develop tolerance, and that's the case with mushrooms and mescaline and other psychedelics. But that had never been established with DMT. Even giving it in cats every 2 hours for 3 weeks, they still responded to the last dose as much as they did to the first one. And so I thought, well, you just have to space the doses closer together. So we gave, DMT a big dose every half hour, 4 times,
Mm-hmm.
and there was no tolerance. So
Interesting.
it was also interesting in that, people did, therapeutic work in that, protocol, even, though they weren't depressed or didn't come in with problems.
Right.
You go through a lot when you take 4 doses of DMT in like 2 hours. So toward the end of my DMT book, I suggest, well, if there is no tolerance to repeated dosing, you could infuse it over the space of a number of hours, and you would do that for a couple of reasons. One is you would be able to characterize the DMT state better. When you inject or smoke DMT, it's over before you get your bearings most of the time.
Mm.
You hold on, whoa, and you get your bearings, and then you start coming down. So the communication with the beings is kind of time limited, kind of rushed.
Mm-hmm.
Really fulsome exploration of the state isn't really possible. So if you can prolong the state, you could get a handle on it better. Like for example, you could tinker with the objects in there. You could take a hammer, maybe, and
Right.
one of these globes or mountains or rocks or jewels, and what happens if you tap it with a hammer? Does it spark? Does the hammer go through it? What exactly is the nature of
Our world
the
implodes if you do
contents?
that.
Yeah.
um, and you could interact with the beings in a more leisurely manner. You could establish more facile channels of communication. One of the frequent complaints of my volunteers was that the language was a problem, a shared language between the beings and the volunteer. They couldn't quite hear each other, understand each other. Gestures weren't that clear. So you could establish a more enduring relationship, with the beings in those states. Um, you know, so the other thing I think that would be valuable with a continuous infusion model like that is, for a therapeutic tool. Let's say you've got a psychological problem. You're depressed. You're traumatized. Uh, you can titrate the effect. You can start off with with a slow infusion rate, and they could work on stuff to the point that they're comfortable. Then they could either request the infusion stop, or you want to stop it. Um, like as the clinician,
Right.
and spend some time, processing what they just went through. And then you'd say, well, you want to go back? You want to go deeper? You want to not go as deep this time? And, go in and out, titrate the amount of intensity that they're able to and willing to endure. And I think you could make a lot of progress. When you take LSD or psilocybin in one of these psychotherapy studies, you're committed once you swallow the pill.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
But you're not quite so committed if you can turn it off, and it resolves in 15 minutes. So you can go in and out, in and out, in and out.
Right.
One other possibility is it's a long way to Mars, 3 years
Right.
or 3 months. I can't remember, but it's
3 years.
something. It's a
Yeah.
long time. And yeah, and what are you going to do for those 3 years? So I mean, why not keep somebody in a prolonged DMT state for as long as it's healthy and safe? So
Sure.
the time would pass by rather quickly.
I know when we were talking to him, he was getting ready to do the prolong intravenous experiment. Has he done that yet? Do you know?
Well, there's a group at Imperial College that's working on it right now. I'm
Okay.
not sure exactly where they're at. I was consulting early on. They're working on the infusion rate, mathematical models, for the amount you give it first, then the rate after you've peaked. Um, like all human research is pretty much ground to a halt in the whole world with everything.
Yeah,
Not only
exactly.
psychedelics. So I think they're taking a pause. But still, they were working on it,
Mm-hmm.
and There's a group in Stockholm that's working on the mathematics of it. Yeah, so it's going to happen. I'm not sure exactly when.
Well, I've mentioned it many times on the show before, but I have clinical OCD, and I've had really good experiences with macro doses of psilocybin mixed with CBT therapy, which has helped me keep it at a nominal level. I've even been able to use the OCD to my advantage. But I'm formally offering my services as a test subject. If anybody wants to throw me in that experiment, I'm down. So what's your experience been with the DMT entities, or have you had any interactions, or have you experienced them? And if so, what do you think they are, or what do you think's going on there?
Well, early on, I would, tell people I'm not going to say whether or not I've used DMT, because if I say that I have, I'll be accused of being a zealot. And if I, say, that I haven't, I'll be accused of not knowing what I'm talking about. But, last year I, did a gig with, Graham Hancock. I'm in Sedona. And, I finished that study 25 years ago. So
Mm-hmm.
I figure, well, I can let the cat out of the bag. So I described my first DMT experience with, Terence McKenna, back in 1986. Yeah, and it was an encounter with the beings. I was absolutely floored. Yeah, and they emerged out of a flaming waterfall of raging color. There were about a half a dozen of them, 3 to 4 feet tall. They just kind of emerged out of this waterfall, and they chirped or lilted or whatever telepathically spoke to me, saying, now do you see? Now do you see? Now do you see? And that went on for a few minutes, and I came down and decided to study DMT.
Mm. So, since your research in the early 90s and all the research that's gone on since that everybody else has done, do you think that there's more of a mystical or mystery surrounding this topic or DMT, or less mystery? Do you think maybe you sucked the mystery out of it by doing it, or maybe it lost a little bit of its mysticism? Or, how do you feel about that?
Well, the chemistry and the electricity is not especially complicated.
Mm-hmm.
It's like an engineering problem. You'll be able to figure out the wiring
Right.
and the chemistry, and you can fine tune your understanding, obviously, to more and more precise levels, degrees of resolution. But after a certain point, I mean, what's the point? You could get down to the quantum level, I guess.
Right.
But the reason that I moved more to the spiritual or the religious questions raised by the DMT effect is because of the information content, which I think is much more important than the electricity and the chemistry. What can you learn in these states? What can you bring back from them that makes both you and your society a better place? So that's not going to be answered by the chemists and the electricians. It'll be answered by the people who have got the intellectual, the moral, the virtue, the intelligence, the imagination to extract information from those states and relay it, to the larger, community.
Yeah, the philosopher kings, if you will. But yeah, I just want to wrap it up here. But I just want to say thank you. Thank you for all the work you've done and the research and, putting it down on paper and writing the books and everything. So we really appreciate that. We really appreciate the movie as well. But the other aspect of it is you have an open mind, and it seems like life's full of mysteries. And if we had more scientists that were open to a little bit more of that, maybe we could get a little bit further in some of these categories. But yeah, again, thank you for coming on, and thank you for all the work that you've done.
Thanks for coming on. We appreciate it.
Well, sure. You're both welcome. Yeah, I enjoyed the line of questioning. One thing I'd like to, pitch is my novel, which came out last year, Joseph Levy Escapes Death.
Okay.
It's kind of a change of pace, but you can tell I wrote it.
Yeah, it's semi-autobiographical, correct?
Guy in a small, yeah, pretty much semi-autobiographical. With an emphasis on autobiographical and a de-emphasis on semi. But it's about a character in a small Southwest town who becomes ill with a couple of serious infections and spends a year recovering. And it's medical humor, psychologically rather dark, but most people laugh when they're reading it. It's currently being converted into an Audible book. I have a narrator I've been working with, and we're closing in on finishing it. So it'll be an Audible book probably within the next few weeks as well.
Nice.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet, but I have it loaded up and ready to go. And we're gonna have all the links to all your stuff down below the video. If you haven't checked out DMT in the Spirit Molecule, definitely check that out. Read the book, watch the documentary. If you haven't read DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, check that out for sure. And obviously his new one, Joseph Levy. So, but again, we will have all the links down below. Everybody stay safe out there, and we will definitely have you back on in the future after I develop another 10 to 12 interesting questions. But thank you again for so much of the work that you've done, and we look forward to anything you do in the future.
Okay, thanks a lot. Take care. Be safe.
You too.
You too. Peace. I want to thank you all for watching and listening. I have all the links to Dr. Strassman's book and website and everything down below. I also have the links to our Patreon and website down below. Please check those out. Again, we are also on Discord now, so if you're active on Discord, please join our channel. Everyone stay safe and healthy, and stay tuned.